There were very few that went on to school.
2 of us became college professors. 2 became dentists. 1 became a medical doctor, that was a cousin of mine, and another one became what was he? Anyway, there were 2 or 3 dentists, and an attorney, a guy named Kay Cornaby became a very, very well-known attorney and considered running for governor of the state at one time. But for the most part, they did not go on to school. They went to high school, and that was it. And of my classmates now, 54 have died already.
Out of how many?
Probably about 130, about half are dead.
No, about probably 35%
Yeah.
are dead. And that's about the same with mine, about a third are dead. And
The ones that have been
they didn't
dying,
live a good life.
the ones that have been dying are the ones that didn't keep the word of wisdom.
Yeah.
Some of those people, some of those kids that were such good kids and such good friends, they started smoking and drinking, and they just didn't live a gospel-centered life. And I've been to more funerals where these guys have been laying there in the caskets just emaciated. The bodies have just been ravaged by the drugs and the drink and the
Cancer and
tobacco and so forth that they used. Some of them just drank themselves to death. But we had a lot of good kids. I still go there and still have a lot of good friends there. I have a lot more good friends there than from Idaho Falls, where I actually graduated from high school.
How old were you when you moved to Idaho Falls?
Your senior year in high school.
I had my last year of high school in Idaho Falls. When I was a junior, my mother was working over at what they call the infirmary, sort of a nursing home, and in between Springville and Provo, and she got offered a job as a manager for a Dairy Queen, which was a real good position for her because the other was shift work, and she'd have to go sometimes from midnight to 8 o'clock, and from 8 o'clock until 2 o'clock, or from 2 o'clock until midnight, or whatever it was. And so she said to Kay and to I, she said, would you move up to Idaho Falls with me? And she thought, I got this good job up there. So we moved, and I stayed down and finished my junior year of high school in Spanish Fork, and then I moved.
And lived with Madge and Hagen.
I lived with Madge and Hagen, and Brent and Arlene and Carolyn and Denny.
And that's why you were so close to him.
Yeah, well, we were
Partially.
We were always close because Madge and my mother were brothers or sisters.
Really close sisters.
But even more so though.
But when I went up to Idaho Falls, I was introduced to a whole new world of kids that were really committed to the gospel.
So it was a
Kids
blessing.
who lived the gospel their
Oh,
whole
yeah.
lives, and the group I associated with, for the most part, were from inactive families, and the kids weren't taught anything like your kids are being taught. And
That was in Spanish Fork?
that was in Spanish Fork. And so I got up there, and my friends were Catholics. My best friend was, one of my best friends was a Catholic, but...
What was his name?
His name was Jerry Brady. He later ran for governor of the state of Idaho and was a major newspaper owner and television station owner. But David Jepson became the executive vice president for Intermountain Healthcare, and Jim Pike became famous as a singer,
In what band?
He was with the Freshmen, is that what?
No, the
Letterman. The Letterman.
The
And
Letterman.
They sold hundreds of millions of records. And were one of the best known musical groups in the 50s and 60s.
Is he still alive?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Jim Pike was not a member of the church, and I had a good influence on him, and I told him that he ought to come down to BYU and go to school with us. And he said, well, I'm not a member of your church. And I said, well, come on down. I said, Jim, you'll like BYU. So he came down, and I remember when we'd always ask the blessing on the food, and individually, and I can remember Jim would always bow his head and do the same thing. And one time I said, Jim, I didn't know you could pray and ask the blessing on the food like that. And he said, well, I really don't. He said, what I do is I figure that you guys say your prayers as long as I can count to 10 or 15, so I count to 10 or 15, and anyway, I did not know that he became a member of the church, but my friend, Kent Madsen, who was an FBI agent back in the Midwest, one time gave me a call, and he said, I ran into a guy that had his car stolen, and he said he knew you, and I said, who was it? He said his name was Jim Pike. He said, a member of the famous Letterman Trio. And I said, what did he say? And he said that you were instrumental in getting him to BYU, and you're the reason why he joined the church. And then Kent said, well, I know Clark. He's a good friend of mine. And so those guys had a wonderful chat, and Kent helped him find his car and get his car back. But I always felt good that Jim did say that Clark Thorstenson was instrumental.
Well, then the Letterman came to BYU when we were students there, and they had a concert at BYU, and from the concert he said, and I want to thank Clark Thorstenson because he's the one that was instrumental in bringing me into the church. And you know, Clark was a student body officer, so everyone knew him, and that was kind of a neat thing for Jim to have said about Dad.
Yeah.
But one of the turning points in my life was moving from Spanish Fork to Idaho Falls. The next turning point was my mother had remarried to a man, had remarried, and she married a man that was very vehemently hostile towards the church. And because I wanted to go to church, he was hostile towards me, so I was never really welcome in my home after my mother married him. And he told me, he said, Clark, if you want to go to school, he said, I'll pay your way to Idaho State or Boise State or University of Idaho. But he said, I won't give you a blankety blank penny if you go to BYU. And I made the decision that I would go to BYU. And so
He held true to his word.
So I never got a penny from him. But going down to BYU was great. I had a former bishop, Johnny Warner, who came to me one time when I was just finishing up high school, and he said, Clark, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, I think what I've got to do is I'm going to go in the Navy, and I'll be there long enough to get the GI Bill, and I'll come back and go to school. And he said, well, let me tell you, why don't you just go to school for one semester or one quarter? And I said, why should I do that? And he said, well, trust me. He said, you go that one quarter and see what you think, and then do whatever you want to do. So I promised him I would, and so I went to BYU that one quarter. Then years later, after I finished my master's degree and my doctorate degree, I went to him and I said, Johnny, thanks for the advice. He said, Clark, I knew that if you'd go one quarter, you wouldn't be able to stay away. And he said, I'm so proud of you being able to finish school, because you said you never had any help. You did it by yourself. And I was always grateful for that. But then I went to BYU. I took the religion classes. I listened to people with testimonies. I learned about the gospel. And then I went to Spanish Fork to church one day, and because that's where I grew up. And when I was just beginning of my sophomore year of school, and this man, Elmer Fillmore, came to me and he said, Clark, what are your plans? And I said, well, I'm going to go to school and for a couple of years, then go in the Navy. And he said, well, what about a mission? And I said, well, I really don't have enough money to go on a mission. And he said, well, do you have any support at all? I said, I have no support. And he said, well, he said, think about it, and I'll think about it. And then I went back a few weeks later, and he said, our elders quorum will help pay for your mission. And he said, you've got to earn some money, and you've got to take what you have that might be valuable and sell it. And he said, and then you've got to find somebody else to help you. And at that point, my sister Kay said, Clark, the Elders Quorum said they'd give me $35 a month, and I needed $20 more. And Kay said, I will pay the extra money. She was active in the church. She was dating a non-member at the time, and I said, well, okay, I'll do that. So I interviewed. I went down and interviewed with my bishop. My board, my membership record was still over in Spanish Fork, even though I lived in Idaho Falls. And my bishop was Byron Gustafson, and he said, I can remember the interview. He said, he had all the questions in front of him, and he said, now Clark. He looked at me and he said, you haven't done anything wrong, have you? And I said, oh. I said, well, I guess not. And he said, he signed it, and he said, I'm going to write this little statement on there that you should go to Denmark or Iceland, something like that, because you're Icelandic. And then I took it down to my stake president, who knew me, and his name was J. Angus Christensen, just a prince of a man. And he was just coming in from the fields. He had his muddy boots on, and he saw me in front of his place, and it was out by Palmar or Benjamin, and he said, oh, Clark, it's nice to see you. You're going to go on a mission, huh? And I said, yes, I'd like to. And he said, where's your papers? And I had it in the papers, and he signed it. And he said, no interview. No interview, nothing. He said, and these are his exact words. He said, well, he said, they'll scare the hell out of you, but they'll still let you go after, in spite of that. And I thought, what do he mean by that? And he signed it, and that was the interview. And,
They'll scare the hell out of you in Salt Lake.
Yeah.
Because at that time you had to go to Salt Lake too.
Yeah, you're in
Was
the.
there an MTC, or did you go
There
straight
was
to?
what they called a mission home in Salt Lake.
How long were you there before
Just
they
a
just
week.
A week.
have fun?
Yeah, and anyway, then I had to have an interview with the general authority. You had to interview with the general authority, everybody did. So I went to a general authority, and his name was Hunter. I can't think of his first name right now.
Oh.
But he interviewed me very fast, and he said, have you straightened your life up? And I said, yes, I've straightened my life up. And he said, well, I've got your name, I've got your address. He said, I'll submit it to the brethren. And so at that point, school was out, so I went up to Idaho Falls, and I got myself a part-time job. Well, I got myself a job working in a lumber yard. And so while I was working up there at the lumber yard, the mission call didn't come. The mission call didn't come. The mission call didn't come. And I waited and I waited. And finally somebody said, well, there's an apostle by the name of Spencer W. Kimball that's going to be in Firth, and there's going to be a state conference there, and he'll be at that conference. Why don't you go down and talk to him? So I went down. After the meetings were over, I went to him and I said, Elder Kimball, I submitted my papers here a couple of months ago and I haven't heard a word. And he said, well, give me your name and so forth, and he said, I'll check it out. I got a letter about 3 days later, and he said, Clark, they made him they got miscommunicated with your mission call. And he said, but I want you to know that you have been called by the Lord to go to Denmark on your mission, and he said, and that more information will be coming to you as to the time and the date and so forth and what you need to do. And then about another week later, by the way, my mother called me and she said, Clark, we've got a letter here from the church. Do you want me to open it and read it? And I said, yeah, open it and read it. And it was from him, Elder Kimball, and he said, you've been called to Denmark and you'll get more information later. So she read it to me. And
Was she excited for you?
yeah, she was excited. My mother always had, well, she didn't always have great faith, but she knew the gospel well enough to want me to go. Well, she didn't know. I had talked with everybody in my family, and the only person that said, Clark, you ought to go on a mission was my sister Kay. And anyway, I got called to Denmark, and I remember
Did you get any other correspondence at all besides that letter from him?
They sent me the letter saying you need this, you'll need to have this amount of money and so forth. So I went down to, so I had that part-time job, and I bought a suit of clothes, 2 suits of clothes. I bought a coat, I bought the garments and all the other things that I needed, and got ready. And then I went down to Salt Lake with a friend of mine. He was entering the mission field the same time I was, and he was going to England. And I remember I really wasn't used to praying and didn't do anything, but I went to his mission farewell, and he asked me to give either the closing or the opening prayer. And I had memorized a good prayer so that I could do it right. But I was so scared that when I stood up to walk to the pulpit to give the prayer, I collapsed.
His legs went out from
My
under
legs
him.
went up. I picked myself up. And,
You're scared to death.
yeah,
My dad, who has no problem speaking in public now, was scared to death back then.
Oh, that's scary. But I went down to what they call the mission home in Salt Lake, and I think there were 85 of us. And
85 whole missionaries
Yeah.
in the mission home at any given time. And in today's world, how many missionaries go into the MTC each week?
they all-
700.
And that's just Provo. How many missionaries around the world are in the missionary training center at any given time? Thousands. Thousands.
Anyway,
Yeah, real quick. What was the membership of the church at the time you went on your mission?
probably not more than
About 1 million.
a million.
About 1 million.
And now there's over 14 million.
Yes.
But anyway, I got down there, and then I realized I needed money for food, and I needed money for this, I needed money for
And he
that.
didn't have any money.
I didn't have any money, and I hadn't had my farewell yet, but I went for about 4 days without anything. I didn't have any money, and I was too proud to say to anybody, hey, I need some money and I need some help. So
Starving to death.
So then came time for my missionary farewell, and then I went down to Spanish Fork, and probably 2/3 of the people that came to my farewell, and the church was filled, were not active in the church, but they wanted to come because I was an Icelander and my name was Thorstenson, and they had loved me. So people gave me $1 and $2 or $5, and nobody gave me any more than $10, but I ended up with about $200, and was able to get on a train
And his mother made him a huge lunch so that he, between here and New York, or between Provo
I had
and
about
Salt Lake and New York.
about 4 days on the train,
And he ate this lunch that she had made
so
him
we ate the
for
same.
4 days.
We ate, and they gave us a bunk bed, but we had to put 2 guys in a bunk bed, so one would sleep with the head one this way, and the other would sleep with his head the other way. That way we got some sleep, and we ended up in New York, and we went up at Niagara Falls, and then in New York, Cleveland, Niagara Falls, New York, and then we got on this ship that was called the SS Stockholm, and there the food was all paid for, and so we got these nice ships, and then we all of a sudden, there were about 8 of us, and all of a sudden we realized that we wouldn't be able to go out on a date or kiss a girl for the next 2.5 years, and there were some beautiful Danish girls on that ship. And every night they had a dance, and we'd go there and sit, and those girls would come and plead with us to dance. And I remember there was one girl named Ilsa Abelgård, and she was a real nice person, and she and I became friends. And I said, I'll be able to speak your language in 6 months. And she said, Clark, that's an impossibility. But we sat with these little, my companion and I, Elder Kimmel, sat with this table of 6 other Swedish and Danish ladies, and every meal they told us, you ask if it'd be okay if you asked the blessing on the food. So for 7 days on that ship, we on every breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we would take turns asking the blessing on the food. And one day they had a church meeting, and they asked me if I'd speak at the LDS church meeting, and there was only a handful of us. No, it was a regular, just a regular church meeting with a Protestant minister, and they asked me if I'd speak, which I did. But 6 months after I arrived in Copenhagen, Denmark, I called Ilse Appelgaard, and I spoke to her in Danish, and it almost floored her. And but those girls would have loved to have dated us, and we would have loved to have dated them, but we didn't. And I thought, how am I going to go for 2.5 years this way? Anyway, so I got over, and I ended up serving in Denmark and had a very successful and a good mission. And that was the next big major event of my life that started turning me moving me in the direction the Lord wanted.